Gabor's father Rudolf turned the house into a treasure trove, assembling an extraordinary collection of paintings and sculptures, from 14th century religious works to a Renoir and a Van Dyck.
This is the painting of my father when he was about 50 years old. He was mainly interested in art and culture. Of course, he followed the events. We were listening always to the BBC every evening, and so we were in the picture.
The pre-war order was in peril. Hitler flaunted his battle fleet to the approval of Hungary's dictator Admiral Horthy. And when German troops marched into Czechoslovakia, Rudolf Bedow made preparations for a fresh start.
My parents were very much afraid of Hitler. They thought sooner or later it will come also here. So my father arranged to send the best works of art to London. He regarded it as a lifeboat in case he have to flee, either before the Nazis or the war or both. Then it should be a possibility for us to restart a new life.
Why London? Why England?
We loved England as a country of democracy, freedom. We looked to England as the country where one could live, where there is absolute freedom for everyone.
But time had run out. Hungary's Jews were first persecuted by homegrown fascists, then by the Germans.
One put his gun on me. I had to stay like that. Then my mother had to call my father. They told him he must come with them. They took him to them and blackmailed him. They was told he has much gold, and if he doesn't give it to them, he will be executed.
But the architect of the final solution, Adolf Eichmann, wasn't satisfied with gold. By the winter of 1944, the Nazis had overseen the extermination of 600,000 Hungarian Jews from the provinces. Then they turned to the capital. The Bedou's lawyer, Kalman Gafash, was a childhood friend of Gabor and recalls the terror of the occupation.
One evening they took my mother in the night, it was winter, in the night, without close to the Danube. Not only my mother, the whole house. And then they shot every man, also children who were in my age, 14, 15. And then they took the women to the ghetto.
He evaded capture, but his father was put on a train for an extermination camp where he died. Gabor Bedou's aunt suffered the same fate. The death trains which left here for Auschwitz might have carried even more victims. But the Jews of Budapest had a saviour. The remarkable Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg came here again and again to bargain for lives, sometimes literally dragging people from the carriages. In the last months of the war, the efforts of Wallenberg saved many lives, and the advance of the Red Army cut the rail lines to the death camps, preventing the Germans from completing their extermination plan. And so, unexpectedly, the Bedoues, like most of their fellow Jews from Budapest, survived.
This was the scene from St. Paul's, where this film was being made of the terrible spectacle at the height of the race.
1,000 miles from Budapest, Rudolf Bedou's art treasures had also been at risk from the German war machine. Throughout the Blitz, the Bedow collection was stored in a warehouse on this corner. Amazingly, it survived the firestorm which destroyed most of the city. So much for the good news. The bad news for Mr. Bedow was that the British government seized his property and refused to give it back at the end of the war. So what happened to the paintings? I went to the WWII library at Somerset House, armed only with an incomplete list and some pre-war photos, and asked an art historian to help me find out.
You can go through each of the boxes here, which are by name, and look up the artist quite readily. So it's by chance that you might or might not come across the picture you're looking for. And it turned out that there were a good many good leads from the WWII here. There was a particular picture by an Italian artist called Giordano, and again that seemed to have started its trail, as recorded here, around about the early 1960s with a London dealer. And it was an inquiry through a dealer that actually led to the second really very big step in the investigation.
92,000. Are you quite sure? 92,000 pounds bar telephone. 92,000. Anybody else like to take up the cudgel? 92,000 pounds. 95,000. Far corner, 98,000 pounds. I shall sell. Really is your last chance. 98,000 pounds.
And the trail leads to this sale room off New Bond Street. It was here on the 22nd of November 1955 that dozens of paintings and sculptures, described simply as the property of a continental collector, went under the hammer. They included a Van Dyck, works by Mayol and Della Robbia, and a Renoir still life which went for just £10. The lots were placed by solicitors acting for the British government, and neither the auctioneer nor the buyers had reason to believe that there was anything unusual about the sale.
Lot 45. Showing here, sir.
Today, such an auction would raise millions. Then it realised £4,500. But in any case, none of the money went to Mr. Beddoe. It disappeared into the treasury coffers as Britain disposed of assets confiscated from enemy nations. No distinction was made between funds belonging to the fascist regimes and those of their mainly Jewish victims.
This is Hungary calling. This is Hungary calling. For the sake of God and freedom, help Hungary.
In Budapest, the Beddoes, like thousands of others, had more urgent preoccupations. Tanks were once again on the streets as the Red Army crushed the revolution of 1956. With the chance of freedom extinguished, Rudolf Beddoe devoted his life to the quest for his pictures. In the country's Fine Art Museum, the director remembers him poring over books and catalogues and reminding himself of his lost treasures. These are the kinds of paintings that Mr. Beddoe
collected earlier on, yes. And he liked very much, and even this piece is Jacopo di Cione.
He had a Jacopo di Cione in his collection.
A very similar one, even to these.
And it's a very fine
piece. And relatively in a good condition.
Rudolf Beddoe couldn't understand how Britain could seize his masterpieces.
He was shocked and could not understand that a democratic country like England could confiscate the fortune of someone who is Jew, who was persecuted first by the Nazis, then by the Soviets and the communists. How is this possible that just such a blow comes from those who were regarded as friends?
Now Hungary is rebuilding after the collapse of communism, and Gabor Beddoe's lawyer feels the time is ripe to settle old debts.
I'm certain that he cannot get back the paintings, but I think that the English state will acknowledge its responsibility because in similar cases other states like Switzerland also acknowledge their responsibility.
And when news reached Hungary that its citizens might be eligible for compensation from Britain, Mr. Gaffash wrote to the Holocaust Educational Trust in London. The chairman of the trust, Lord Janner, was astonished when he received the letter.
I'm surprised at this one. This is not only a very big claim, but it's a provable claim. It was right, proper and appropriate to sell off goods, property, artworks belonging to Nazis. It was disgraceful to sell off artworks, property, assets belonging to people who were murdered by the Nazis, people who were persecuted by the Nazis.
Meanwhile, evidence of the value of the collection has emerged from Ian Locke's research at the WWII Library. He He studied the prices which the paintings have fetched as they've appeared at art sales all over Europe.
As time's gone on, I've seen that his collection was actually very well chosen. Well, the interesting thing about the whole collection is that it is almost all of museum quality. It's the sort of stuff that would have ended up in museums, therefore has a value in itself which is very high. And I think that they would have been exceptionally lucky to have held on to their collection in this respect. They would have been very wealthy indeed.
We've learned that one of the Beddoes paintings, a Madonna and Child from the 14th century, is in this art dealer's. Its owners are German, and we were told it was most unlikely we'd be given permission to film it.
We're going to come over here and look at a painting of...
But after more research, finally the breakthrough. We found one of the Beddoes paintings, an extraordinary work, in the North Carolina Museum of Art.
Them as doctors, and I always tell the children, here's our first transplant. This man has died, and they've cut off the leg of this dead Moor and replaced his cancerous leg with the leg from the dead Moor.
St. Cosmas and St. Damian was painted on a church altar or pillar in the 14th century. Uniquely, it survived intact, and it's probably worth $500,000.
And if the son of its original owner, Mr. Beddoes, wanted it back, what would you say?
I think I would refer him to the museum's council. I would say, come and see the picture here, come and see how it's being enjoyed by thousands of visitors to our museum, and then see if you still want it back.
We went to North Carolina to see it.
Yeah.
We brought back here
What a beautiful, very beautiful.
of the painting.
Back in Budapest, I presented a copy of the painting, which was last in this room 60 years ago, to Gabor Beddoes.
That's fantastic, it's beautiful, indeed. he told me once, it is not interesting what a picture is dealing with, it is how, it's the quality which is interesting, how it is done. It may be a landscape or a portrait, it's the same.
The Central Synagogue in Budapest is the largest in the world, though its congregation these days has shrunk pitifully. Only 100,000 Hungarian Jews survived the Holocaust. But at the century's end, there's a chance of restitution for some of those who lost money or property. Britain has pledged £2 million to a compensation fund. The value of the Beddoes claim alone at today's prices could be £5 million. The question from those still alive to ask it is, what price morality?
And Lord Archer, who's going to advise the government on how to deal with this very thorny question, is here now. Who do you think owns that painting?
If we're talking about a legal title to it, there is no doubt, I think, as a matter of law, that the painting vested in the British government at the time. So far as I know, it was sold perfectly properly. And I imagine that the present person who thinks he owns it really does own it.
So this raises the question of compensation. Now, it's taken 50 years to appoint you. It surely would be unreasonable if compensation were to be fixed at the level of price fetched 50 years ago.
Well, let me begin by making clear, I am not here to pass judgment on individual cases. That's not what the government has asked me to do.
No, this was a general question.
Yes, can I just... Well, let me just get clear. What the government has asked me to do is to advise on setting up a scheme, because this government wants to do what is fair and just. Now, one of the questions which we'll have to address is precisely the basis of compensation. Right. Should it be the value of the asset when it was confiscated? Should we add something by way of interest? Should it be the value of the asset today?
In this case, we have an estate estimated to be worth about £5 million today's prices, fetched £4,500 when it was sold. Is it reasonable, in your view, that it should be valued for purposes of compensation?
Well, I'm sorry, you are not going to bounce me at this stage into passing judgment on an individual case.
Right.
I don't know enough.
At a general level,
I don't know enough about it.
Should it, at a general level, is it not reasonable that prices be fixed at current values?
Not necessarily. We don't know that the asset would have remained in the hands of the owner throughout all these years. So there are all sorts of questions which need to be asked. I think the government would want to do what is fair. I may recommend that that values should be the current values, but it's too early to say, and we've too many questions to ask.
If you did that, we were talking about there, one particular case worth £5 million, the total value of available in the government coffers for compensation is £2 billion.
Now, the government has said that in the first instance it's going to set aside £2 million. Now, I'm sure that that was an honest estimate of what they thought would be required. If it transpires that more is required, then that's the question which the government will have to address. But what I'm concerned with is what is the value which ought to be paid by way of compensation.
Okay,
if it transpires to be more than £2 million...
And you're not going to tell us whether, because you were going to say that you're just starting to consider this, but will you also be considering whether there are, as it were, deserving cases and undeserving cases?
Oh,
or is everyone the same?
One of the things that I will clearly have to address is what should be the situation in which people are compensated. What happened was that the government in the Second World War confiscated the assets of enemy aliens, by which it meant people living in enemy countries. Now, people who were living in Hungary weren't all, of course, Nazis. Many of them suffered severely under the Nazis. And so we'll have to...
Indeed, under the Russians.
Well, no, we're talking about the Second World War when it was confiscated, when what we were dealing with were the Nazis. Now, we will have to distinguish between people who were Nazi supporters and people who were victims of the Nazis. And that's one of the rules we'll have to talk about. It is true that some people subsequently were prevented by the Russians from making their claims earlier.
Lord Archer, thank you very much. In a moment, is the health service being